Hello, and welcome to Virtual National Quilting Day at the International Quilt Museum. I'm Lauren Holt, Education Coordinator at the museum. For today's presentation, and in honor of Women's History Month, we asked our volunteers and staff to nominate women in quilting who had made significant impacts on their communities. Some of the nominations we received honor women who are local to our quilting community here in Lincoln, Nebraska, while others do their work around the world. Many quilters learn quilting from family or from friends in their local community. At the International Quilt Museum, we know that our efforts in quilt preservation would be much more difficult without the work of local quilt guilds around the U.S., and especially without the generous support of our volunteers here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So we are honored to have this chance to recognize some of the wonderful women who have helped teach, document, and preserve quilting traditions here in our own local community. The first person we'd like to recognize today is Jean Aang, who has long been an active volunteer with us here at the International Quilt Museum and, in the words of nominator Chris Steele, has been a quilt volunteer since way before our current museum was built. Jean is an avid quilter who has been active with the local Lincoln Quilters Guild and made many quilts for raffles, fundraisers, or to be given to people in need. She also quilts for her family, especially her 3 great-granddaughters, and during the pandemic, she has taken the time to complete some unfinished projects, virtually sharing the results with her weekly quilting group. Chris added, Jean is a woman who is years younger than her chronological age and shows no sign of slowing down in her desire to quilt or continuing to volunteer at the museum. In 2014, Jean was interviewed by the Quilt Alliance's Go Tell It at the Quilt Show project, speaking about a 1950s quilt kit she had purchased at auction in 1997 and then finished by hand. That quilt is now part of our collection, seen here on the right, and you can watch the interview on YouTube. You can find the link in the description. Lois Wilson has also been a very active longtime volunteer at the International Quilt Museum. She was part of the Nebraska Quilt Project, currently chairs the Lincoln Quilters Guild Scholarship Committee, is a past president of the Friends of IQM board, and volunteers at the museum as both a docent and in collections care. She has also served as a chairperson for First Quilts at First United Methodist Church for over 15 years, working to present quilts for babies at their baptism. Pat Hackley noted that Lois is a very caring and gracious person, generous with her time and talent. She said, I admire Lois as a very talented quilt designer, a skilled quilt maker, and for her generosity in sharing her quilts with family, friends, and causes she believes in. For at least 15 years, Lois has donated a quilt or handmade item to causes such as Every Woman Matters, the Nebraska Wildlife Federation, and the Lincoln Quilters Guild Auction, Cedars, Partners of the Americas, and the Nebraska State Quilt Guild. Lois shared with us that her interest in quilting grew from her childhood in the Nebraska Sandhills, with, as she says, a mother who allowed me time to hone my skills, a dad who knew the land like the back of his hand, 2 grandmothers who were stitchers, one who created much of my clothing until I could make my own, the other whose quilts I enjoyed as a child, a reassuring 4-H leader, and 2 excellent home economics instructors. She had initially planned to start quilting when she retired, but her daughter invited her to take a quilting class together a few years before that point, and Lois says, I was hooked and never looked back. She was especially inspired by lectures and workshops conducted by Ruth McDowell, which led her to make several landscape quilts, many of them featuring her memories of the Sandhills. One of her quilts from those workshops, Barred Behind Branches, is pictured here on display at the Prairie Art Center in North Platte, Nebraska. It is machine-pieced, barring one applique exception, and the modeled fabric used in the sky was created in a dyeing class taught by Roxanne O'Hare and Leah Sorensen Hayes. Lois said, the quilting community has been very supportive of me in my quilting, as I believe it takes a village, says it all. My membership in the Wednesday Girls as part of the Nebraska Quilt Project has given me meaningful friendships in addition to learning to appreciate the great history of the quilting world. She has also received support from members of other small textile groups, including Basket Cases, Harmonics, and the Contemporary Quilt Group. She added, each of these groups have provided challenges in ways that moved me forward. She also acknowledged the importance of her family, saying, I have a very supportive family, and I couldn't do what I do if my husband didn't do what he does. Lois is particularly dedicated to education. She is pleased to be part of the Lincoln Quilters Guild Scholarship Committee and believes it is very important to always support scholarship of any kind in any way we can. She remembers her mother's words, educate a mother, educate a family, and she has been a member of PEO, a philanthropic educational organization, for more than 60 years, working to support education for women worldwide. Her education efforts also extend to her children and grandchildren, and she says she has found special satisfaction in teaching her grandchildren to use the sewing machine at an early age, and she makes a point, every time she gives a quilt presentation, of encouraging others to find people they can share their talents with. Donna Foda has been a longtime member of the Lincoln Quilters Guild and was nominated for recognition today due to her community commitment, her teaching service, and her exceptional and inspirational hand quilting skills. She has served as treasurer of the Lincoln Quilters Guild and the National Quilting Association Committee, and has frequently donated her hand-quilted work to the Lincoln Quilters Guild auction. Her quilts have won honors at the Nebraska State Fair many times, and she has also led many public hand quilting demonstrations, as well as quilt binding lessons. Speaking of past quilting demonstrations, Joanna Baxter remembered, "Not only did Donna join ladies around the quilting frame outdoors in all kinds of weather, but she often transported the frame boards, assembling them with industrial-sized vice clamps at the demonstration site. With warmth and cheer, she welcomed quilters of all ages and experience. With agile hands, she succeeded with tiny stitches, feathered curves, and popping knots. Donna is greatly respected as an expert quilter and celebrated by all who know her as a sincere, positive, and encouraging true friend." Lois Wilson noted that she became neighbors with Donna a little over 20 years ago, and through their shared rides to monthly guild meetings, she always finds joy in the love and affection Donna shares with their community, and especially with the Faded Blossoms, a group that grew out of the committee for the 1994 Lincoln Quilters Guild show. Lois also shared 2 examples of Donna's work with us for today. The square white work piece is a pillow top Donna made and donated to the Lincoln Quilters Guild auction several years ago. Lois says, "Her quilting stitches are very nearly perfect. It is a real treasure." The second piece, adorned with the words, "A creative mess is better than tidy idleness," and constructed in bright colors of yellow, green, and rainbow fabrics, was a birthday gift to Lois, who says, "This fun piece Donna gave me after being in my work area," a total contrast to her neat area. Pat Hackley has been a member of the Lincoln Quilters Guild since its first organizational meeting in March 1973, and has been a longtime volunteer at the International Quilt Museum in many roles. Lois Wilson noted that Pat is particularly dedicated to maintaining an accurate history of both the Lincoln Quilters Guild and the Nebraska Quilt Project, and is admired by friends for her unflagging encouragement and support in pursuit of community efforts. Pat shared that she learned to quilt from her grandmother, Josephine Combs, and continued to quilt with her mother-in-law, Carrie Hackley. She credited both women as patient teachers, generous with their knowledge. She cites the 1977 Quilt Symposium and, later, the Nebraska Quilt Project as highlights of her work in the quilting community. She is particularly proud to have been part of the Nebraska Quilt Project. Members of the project committee, who became known as the Wednesday Girls, undertook extensive training and 3 years of travel around the state to document and record around 5,000 Nebraska quilts. The resulting book, Nebraska Quilts and Quilt Makers, was published in 1991. It received the Frost Prize for Distinguished Crafts, was honored by the Renwick Gallery at the Smithsonian, and drew the attention of Robert and Artist James to Nebraska and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as a possible home for their quilt collection. That focus and collection, as well as the dedicated work of volunteers from the Lincoln Quilters Guild, led to the establishment and growth of our museum. Pat says, "It has been a wonderful adventure and a big part of my life. I love being a volunteer at IQM and being a part of the activities there. I always look forward to attending each new exhibit and program." She shared 2 quilts with us for today, both gifts she treasures from dear friends. The applique piece at the bottom was made by Virginia Welty, who was also closely involved in the organization of the Lincoln Quilters Guild and the Nebraska Quilt Project. The top quilt, made with a silk necktie and titled "This Must Be Paris," was made by Lois Wilson. Mildred Fauque was closely involved with the Nebraska Quilt Project as a photographer and a contributor. She has also served many roles in the Lincoln Quilters Guild and been recognized for her original designs and skilled hand quilting, with awards from the Lancaster County Fair and Nebraska State Fair, among others. She once ran a successful pattern business and had some of her work published in Quilters Newsletter magazine. In her design process, she sometimes starts by adapting a traditional pattern, but more often cuts up newspaper until she finds a shape she likes and refines her ideas from there. One of Millie's designs, Pine Ridge Star, has its own page in the Nebraska Quilts and Quilt Makers book that the Nebraska Quilt Project produced. The design is based on a combination of a pottery pattern Millie saw while she was in the Pine Ridge region for the project and the traditional Lemoyne Star quilting pattern. She created this new block out of a desire to design a Nebraska quilt pattern. The finished quilt, seen here on the right, is composed of hand-pieced and assembled blue, white, and dark green fabrics. In the book, Millie shared stories of her childhood, her love of nature, and her first quilting projects, including a state birds quilt done with liquid embroidery paint that she declared to be terrible. Her first efforts at quilting were untaught, with large stitches using doubled thread, and she noted that she has taken many classes and learned from many teachers, both locally in Nebraska and nationwide. Our nominators praised Millie's own generous teaching spirit and referenced especially a series of barn quilts that she taught classes on. Lois Wilson shared these papers from a 1993 applique class to showcase the care and attention to detail Millie has been known to take when sharing her expertise. She said, "I admire Millie's generous sharing of her talent and her being humble concerning her success." Sometimes local efforts lead to national or international impacts. Just as the International Quilt Museum itself grew from small individual efforts, so too did the achievements of some of the other women in quilting we want to recognize today. After training and working as an aerospace engineer, Dr. Carolyn Mazlimi came to quilting in the late 1970s and quickly turned her focus to community efforts that continue to this day. Dr. Mazlimi has worked as a historian, curator, lecturer, author, and artist for more than 40 years, creating connections between artists and promoting education on the topics of African American quilts, quilters, and quilting history. She helped found the African American Quilt Guild of Los Angeles in 1981 and founded the well-known Women of Color Quilters Network in 1985. She has published 12 books highlighting African American made quilts, is a member of our advisory board at the International Quilt Museum, and has been involved in promoting the economic and social development of women through the arts for more than 20 years. Dr. Mazlimi was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, lived and studied in Los Angeles, California, and now lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, but her work with the Women of Color Quilters Network takes her on travels to quilting and textile communities around the world. According to a 2002 interview with the Archives of American Art, she started teaching herself quilting in the 1970s after seeing a patchwork quilt in Dallas and being inspired to create her own. Later, she turned to narrative quilts, working on themes of African American history, women's power, and music, especially jazz and blues. When asked what lit her passion for quilt making, she said, "The ability to create a piece of work that's graphically complex from a simple piece of cloth is fascinating. The ability to combine various pieces of cloth, various colors and textures of cloth, to create a graphic piece to me is mind-boggling. And to say one didn't paint it, but yet it looks like a painting, I find extraordinary. It's a wonderful feat, and it feels good. It always feels good after you've completed a piece that you're really in love with." The Women of Color Quilters Network grew out of Dr. Mazlimi's own search for community and quilting history. In her travels in the early 1980s, she noticed that she never saw any African American quilt makers represented at quilt shows, so she put an ad in the Quilters Newsletter magazine to try and get in touch with more African American quilters. From that initial point of connection, the network of quilters grew through word of mouth, first through letter writing, and then with a newsletter featuring information about African American quilts. In 1985, Dr. Mazlimi officially founded the Women of Color Quilters Network as a nonprofit organization with the mission to educate, preserve, exhibit, and document quilts made by African Americans. The foundation has succeeded with connecting its more than 1,700 members to many critically acclaimed traveling exhibitions around the United States, and has also exhibited quilts in Japan, Australia, South Africa, Italy, and England through arts programs sponsored by the United States Department of State. Since 1991, the Women of Color Quilters Network has also worked to teach workshops to women in Africa, South America, and Europe, including quilting and fabric dyeing workshops in Kenya and Nigeria. For their work in creating social and economic opportunities for women around the world, the Women of Color Quilters Network received recognition from the United Nations and the International Labor Department in Geneva. Members of the network are also involved in prison programs for women and in after-school art programs aimed at empowering inner-city youth through quilt making, including giving the students a chance to exhibit and sell their work. For her work in the arts and the quilting community, Dr. Mazlimi has received many state and national honors, including the Ohio Heritage Fellowship Award and the Distinguished Scholar and Celebrated Artist Lifetime Achievement Award from Faith Ringgold's Anyone Can Fly Foundation. She was named a National Heritage Fellow by the National Endowment for the Arts and was the 2016 inductee to the Quilters Hall of Fame Museum. Finally, we'd like to honor the work of a member of our international quilting community. Chuck Nohara is another quilter who has gained a recognition that reaches far beyond the borders of her home community in Japan. You may have heard of her in connection with either her patchwork skills, her pattern books, or her famous quilting students. Chuck Nohara taught quilting in Japan in the 1970s and 1980s, when quilting was first becoming popular in Japan, and some of her students include Yoko Saito and Aiko Okano, who have both toured their work internationally and started quilting schools of their own. In fact, Nohara and her husband established the very first quilt school in Japan, Hearts and Hands Patchwork Quilt School in Tokyo in 1976. By 1981, they were operating 11 quilting schools throughout the country, and their work paved the way for the much larger quilting curriculum and certification program offered by the Japan Handicraft Instructors Association. Operating under the Iemoto system, in which a student emulates the style and technique of a specific teacher until they become proficient in their own right, students at these schools were often learning about American quilting and studying photographs because there were so few quilting resources that had been translated into Japanese. Hearts and Hands Quilting School students and teachers worked to translate quilting articles, and as editors for a Japanese version of an American antique quilts book by Margaret Maddox Kabaga in 1981. In the 1990s, the school hosted quilt festivals that showcased examples of many different styles of American quilts. Today, Chuck Nohara is perhaps most famous in the US and Europe for her pattern books. Some of her works include patchwork bags, useful patchwork gifts, and 2001 new patchwork blocks. Many of these books are out of print and difficult to find, especially 2001 new patchwork blocks, which was most recently republished by Quiltmania, but the designs inside have been greeted with enthusiasm by American and European makers. You can see many of those quilters' resulting blocks on Pinterest or under the @ChuckNohara_OP quilt or #ChuckNoharaQAL hashtags on Instagram. Thank you for joining us in recognizing the contributions of these amazing women to the world of quilting, and I hope you enjoy the rest of our Virtual National Quilting Day.